Thank you, Sam. Is evolution compelling? No, I'll answer that question right now. Because science contradicts it. The scientific evidence contradicts the theory of evolution. It overwhelmingly contradicts evolution. Now, evolution was proposed by Charles Darwin in 1859. The basic idea was that the species arose from chance events, natural law, and natural selection. But in the last 150 years, our scientific knowledge has grown enormously, and it has refuted evolution over and over. Evolution is promoted and mandated not because of the science, but in spite of the science. Why is that? Why do evolutionists not just follow the data? They're smart people. I'll answer that question in a minute. It's an important question. But first, I want to show you some examples of the science. I'll start with microRNA. MicroRNA. You've heard of genes. And genes are in our DNA. Genes are typically used to make proteins. Our cells are constantly making proteins and degrading proteins. There's a constant turnover depending on the need. So this process of protein production needs to be regulated quite a bit. Now, in the 1990s, small genes were discovered. These small genes are used to make microRNA. And microRNA regulates the process of making proteins. Now, the microRNA needs to be regulated as well in turn. And there are certain proteins that regulate microRNA. It's a fascinating system, very complicated, fascinating thing that's been discovered. It's also a problem for the theory of evolution. This is evidence that contradicts evolution. Why? Well, when these microRNA genes were discovered, the idea that evolutionists had an expectation that they would form an evolutionary common descent pattern. What does that mean? Well, everything in the species should form this evolutionary tree. So when you discover something new, it should fall into that evolutionary pattern. So you've already got an existing traditional tree that's been built up over the years. You discover something new, a new feature in these species. Two species that are similar should have similar microRNA genes. Two species that are very different should have microRNA genes that are more different. It's as simple as that. This is fundamental to the theory. The different characters, the different features in all the species should align. They should be congruent on this evolutionary tree. There can be some variations, of course, but not a lot. Well, that all failed. So here's a researcher who looked at this and he said, I've looked at thousands of microRNA genes and I can't find a single example that would support the traditional tree. Another said, it is a very serious incongruence. That's the word. They look for these things to be congruent. If they're not lining up, they're incongruent. Here's a paper that looked at researchers trying to find these microRNA genes. They're hard to find. They're so small. And so they're searching for these. And it had, for years, they were using the evolutionary model. They were using the evolutionary tree as a guide. It wasn't working. And so in this paper here, they say we liberated ourselves from this model. We liberated ourselves from this requirement. If you want to find microRNA genes, don't use evolution. That's not a good model. They also wrote, these findings strongly suggest a wide-ranging species-specific set of microRNA genes. Species-specific, what's that? That means each species has its own little one-off version. That's the opposite of evolution. The whole point of evolution is that the species arose from each other, common descent. So you have these patterns, you have these similarities, you build these trees. That's the whole idea. Species-specific is the polar opposite of evolutionary theory. Doesn't make sense. The scientific evidence contradicts the theory. Now, I don't want you to leave tonight thinking, oh, okay, there's this interesting kind of weird new evidence that was discovered, a couple decades ago, microRNA. it's causing a problem, evolutionists are working on it, they'll figure it out, otherwise it's a pretty good theory. No, this is the tip of the iceberg. So the molecular data in general do not support the traditional evolutionary tree. This isn't just microRNAs. MicroRNAs are not the exception. They're the rule. Here's a paper that talks about that, an article that talks about that. Evolutionary trees from biological molecules often don't resemble those from morphology. What's morphology? That's the bones and the muscles, the visible features. The molecules and the morphology are not congruent. The scientific evidence is contradicting the theory. According to evolution, the molecular and morphological data should agree. They don't. Here's the paper. It says the growing gap between the molecules and the fossils is astounding. Astounding. Here's a paper. There are major disparities between the molecules and the fossils, and solutions to this problem are elusive. This isn't going away. Here's a primate study. You know that under evolution, we're considered to be, our closest evolutionary relative is the chimpanzee. So you've got humans and you've got chimps. And the reason for that is the genome, our DNA. They compare the DNA, and the chimp is the closest one to the human. So we're supposed to be neighbors with the chimp in the evolutionary tree. But if you look at the physiology and the morphology, it doesn't work that way. We're probably closer to the orangutan than the chimp. It's a puzzle. So here's a paper that's talking about that. The author writes, it would be an understatement to think of this as an evolutionary puzzle. Understatement. The molecular and morphological data should agree. They don't. Now, one idea is maybe we just haven't looked at enough data. We got to get more data. This stuff will resolve. Just hang on. We got all these genomes being read off from all these species. Let's just slow down, gather the data. These things will work out. So here's a paper that does that. And then they start off by talking about the fact that, yes, we do expect this pattern. So according to evolution, there should be a hierarchical pattern of relationships among organisms. The different characters should be congruent, right? That's what I said a minute ago. So let's look at some larger data sets. Is that going to help? No, it didn't. It failed. Incongruence, the paper writes, is pervasive. And it has become more acute with the advent of larger data sets. These large data sets have confirmed that incongruence is common and frequently the norm rather than the exception. There should not be such significant incongruence. Yes, you can have a little incongruence. It doesn't have to be perfect. There is some noise in the evolutionary process. We are way beyond the noise level. This is not noise. These are theoretical failures. The scientific evidence contradicts the theory. Here's a paper. Incongruities can be seen everywhere in the universal tree. Now, I don't want you to leave tonight and think, okay, there's this, problem with the evolutionary tree. Things aren't quite working out. Maybe there's something new that the evolutionists will discover. Otherwise, evolution is a pretty good theory. Things are working out. There's just this incongruence going on. No, this is the tip of the iceberg. Incongruence in the evolutionary tree is not an exception. There's all kinds of problems. All the facets of evolution are not working. This is not just simply one problem here. It's not the exception, but the rule. Now, evolution's fundamental predictions across the board have failed, one after the other. I have a web page called Darwin's Predictions, so you can look at that if you want to get some more information on some other areas. I've got 22 predictions. There are 22 fundamental predictions that have gone wrong, that have unequivocally failed. So you can look at this. If you search on my name and Darwin's Predictions, it'll come up. Give you some resources, some background information if you want more information. Now, this brings us to the problem of simplicity. So you've got all these failures. Evolution is failing, failing, failing. What do they do when you have a failure? You patch the theory. You fix the theory. You get in there and you tweak things. You change things. So for years, for decades, for centuries, evolutionists have been changing things, adding, patching. The theory, when it started with Charles Darwin, was reasonably simple. And that's what a scientific theory should be. But now it's become enormously complex. For centuries, we've known that philosophers and scientists have told us, you gotta be simple. Scientific theories must not become too complex. That's the death knell of a theory. Well, evolution is enormously complex now. It would take volumes to describe just the theory. Evolution is like the tax code. Let me give you quickly some examples of this, very quickly. You've heard of gradualism. Well, now we have punctuated equilibrium added on. You've heard of descent with modification. Now we have species-specific biology that I talked about. You've heard about natural selection. Now we have genetic drift. You've heard of common descent. Now we have common mechanism. You've heard of that Lamarck must be wrong. Well, now Lamarck is back. You've heard of, going too fast there. You've heard of the evolutionary tree. Well, now we have a pluralism. We have several different models that are being advocated. As one biologist said, the tree of life is being politely buried. What's less accepted is that our whole fundamental view of biology needs to change. Yes, indeed. You've heard of random mutations. Well, now we have directed mutations. You've heard that Darwin said nature must not make leaps. Well, now we have macromutations and saltationism. You've heard of evolutionary mechanisms. Now we have the unknown mechanism. Yes, evolutionists have the unknown mechanism. They actually write about this. This is a soap opera. This is not a theory. On Tuesdays, it does this. That's not the way science is supposed to work. It's way too complicated. And the complexity is a sign of the failures. Failure leads to complexity. Not good. Okay, sometimes sympathetic witnesses are the best. What do evolutionists say? Well, here's a recent book. On evolution, the evolutionist writes, origin of life research has a dirty, rarely mentioned secret. The origin of life field is a failure. We still do not have even a plausible, coherent model, let alone a validated scenario for the emergence of life on Earth. Here's a post at Scientific American. Don't tell the creationists, but scientists don't have a clue how life began. Here's a paper, a journal paper. How fundamental innovations originate in evolution remains one of the most enigmatic questions of biology. Hello? That's the question. If you're going to say that you have a theory that explains how all of the species arose, you got to answer how the species arose. Fundamental innovations are all through biology. You can't say, well, yeah, we got this theory that's a fact. You got to believe it. You're irrational if you don't accept it. Oh, we got a couple guys over here working on the fundamental innovations part. We haven't quite worked that part out yet. No, it doesn't work that way. The scientific evidence is contradicting the theory. Now, you've heard about competition between species. It's very important in evolution, right? Competition between species. Fundamental concept. So here's a big experiment that they did. They took a whole bunch of algae species and they competed them to see what would happen. And of course, they expected them to follow the evolutionary pattern. And, well, it didn't. It was completely unexpected. When we saw the results, we said, this can't be. We sat there banging our heads against the wall. Darwin's hypothesis has been with us for so long. How can it not be right? When we started coming up with numbers that showed Darwin wasn't right, we were completely baffled. Significant striking similarities in the DNA in distant species. Doesn't make sense on evolution. It contradicts evolution. One evolutionist said, I about fell off my chair. Another said, it can't be true. This is what evolutionists are saying. The theory is mandated not because of the science, but in spite of the science. Why? Why is that? Why are there people who still believe in evolution? Why are they so sure of themselves? Because this isn't about science. This never was about science. 2,000 years ago, the Epicureans said, hey, this world must have randomly arisen by random chance. Sound familiar? 2,000 years ago, that's what they were saying. Their gods would never have created this world. It was too evil, too much death, too much destruction. Fast forward to the modern time, 17th, 18th century, these sorts of ideas were being elaborated on. Yes, you had the problem of evil from the Epicureans, and there were other problems they were attacking. This is the world that Charles Darwin entered into. He agreed, he was sympathetic with these ideas, and he added to them. He didn't start a new idea. Here's how one evolutionist explained it. Odd arrangements and funny solutions are the proof of evolution, paths that a sensible God would never tread, but that natural processes constrained by history follows perforce. No one understood this better than Darwin. He made these arguments. These are philosophical arguments. This isn't science. This is philosophy. There's no scientific experiment that can tell you these things. Is it different today? No. The scientific evidence contradicts the theory, and today's evolutionists are making these philosophical claims. Here's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the most prestigious science organization in the country. How could a creator God have engineered such a deeply flawed biological world, right down to its most elemental molecular features? Are we not guilty of blasphemy and ascribing to him a direct hand in sponsoring the molecular genomic flaws that plague human health? It's a philosophical argument. He's convinced evolution must be true, not because he knows how the species evolved. Here's a textbook saying much the same thing. The genetic code is similar between different species, but would not be if the species had independent origins. What is the scientific experiment that tells you that? An expert witness. Regarding extinctions, without evolution, we are left with a designer who just can't get it right the first time. Nothing he designs is able to make it. That's true. Yeah, we have extinctions. If that means, if you can't believe, if that mandates evolution for you, then you're going to be an evolutionist. But it's not a scientific argument. Here's a book, Why Evolution is True. Tiny, non-functional wings, a dangerous appendix, eyes that can't see, and silly ear muscles simply don't make sense if you think that species were specially created. These philosophical arguments run all through the literature. I'm not cherry-picking here. This book, for example, is chock full of them. Darwin's book was full of them. This is a philosophical argument that mandates evolution in spite of the science. The world has too many defects to have been designed. That's what this is about. Evolution is an age-old mythology. This isn't science. Thank you. Right now I wanted to talk about two more scientific examples in a little bit more detail and about how they contradict evolution. Echolocation, sometimes called biosonar, and the DNA code. You've probably seen sonar in the movies, the ships tracking submarines, submarines tracking ships. It's an indispensable tool in our Navy. And as you can imagine, the technology is pretty advanced these days. Well, sonar is also found in the biological world. A good example is bats. So as bats are flying around, some bats are sending out a pulse, a sequence of pulses or squeaks. And these are reflecting off of little insects, moths, or even mosquitoes. And then the bats are sensing the echo. Can you imagine hearing an echo from a mosquito? It's pretty sensitive. So now these bats, they're small little animals. They don't have a computer. And you probably figure, well, they're probably not as good as our military equipment, right? No, actually, they are better. Let me show you an example here. So this is an encounter between a bat and a moth. the bat is flying from left to right, and this encounter, it covers about 20 feet of the bat's flight, and it's about 1 second. The moth here is kind of flying around, evading the bat, so the bat is tracking the moth, trying to catch it. These circles here along the bat's path are when the bat is emitting a pulse. So again, this is about 1 second. So the time between pulses is about 1/10 of a second. So it's flying along, putting out these pulses. As it gets close to the moth, suddenly that rapidly increases. And you have, instead of 0.1 seconds between the pulses, something more like 1/100th of a second or less. It can even be less than 1,000th of a second for some bats. Incredibly high rate of pulses. Now, what you can't see here are a lot of other things that are going on. In addition to the pulse rate that the bat is adjusting, it also adjusts the duration of the pulses. It also adjusts the intensity or loudness of the pulses. It's also adjusting the pitch of the pulses. So all these things are happening, and of course the bat is flying around at the same time, and it's compensating for its motion. You know, you're flying along and you're hearing the echo at a different place from where you sent out your pulse. So the bat has to be aware of that and figure that out. And there's also a Doppler effect as it's flying around with these sound signals. The bat has to reject clutter, so you have foliage or what have you that's also reflecting the signal. And so the bat has to discriminate between the clutter and the target that it wants to focus on. And the bat can actually image the insect. It's a very advanced technology, imaging using sonar. All of these things it's doing, and it's also solving an advanced guidance problem at the same time. It's doing all this in real time. It's a fantastic system, very fascinating. And everything that it does here makes sense. So when it increases its pulse rate, when it reduces the duration of the pulses and changes the intensity and so forth, all those things make sense. So researchers study this, and they're finding out. One reason why we study this is because we want to learn some secrets. And when they study these things, they find out, oh yeah, it's doing this strategy. So none of this is just happenstance. It's all intelligently using these resources to optimize its tracking. Let me show you a little bit more detail on some of the pulses themselves. So here are 4 of the pulses, and you can actually see the frequency and the time. So the first one here at the far left, when you first begin this encounter, is about kind of long. It's about 10 milliseconds. That's about 1/100th of a second. The pitch or frequency is relatively constant. Now, as it gets closer to the moth, the duration gets shorter and shorter. So this last one here, you're down to about 2 milliseconds. And then you can also see the pitch is changing a little bit. And you can see the curvature. You know, even that curvature is important. So researchers look at that. Even that has an effect on how it can paint the object, how it can sense the image, the object, and reject the clutter and all that stuff. That's very complicated. So it's an amazing system, right? The result, tracking capability is better than our than our military equipment. Fascinating. It's also a problem for evolution. Why? Well, first of all, you're just not going to get this from random mutations. Random mutations are not going to put together this kind of a system, right? Now, you say, well, wait a minute, natural selection did it. No, natural selection doesn't do anything. Natural selection cannot induce a design to come out, to appear, to arise. It cannot induce a mutation, whether it's good or bad. Natural selection can kill off bad things that happen, kill off bad, harmful mutations. It doesn't create things. Designs have to emerge on their own. So according to the theory of evolution, you have these random mutations, undirected random mutations happening that's going to build up these designs. It's just really unlikely. Now, aside from that, you say, well, the evolutionists must have some explanation for this, right? I mean, come on. Well, here's a paper, The Evolution of Echolocation in Bats. That sounds promising. Let's see what they say. Narrowband multi-harmonic signals probably evolved several times independently given their occurrence in several families. That's not really telling me anything here. It's like saying it evolved because it's there. And gee, it also evolved several times. So you've got this fantastic technology, and yeah, it evolved several times because it wouldn't have come from a common ancestor because the bats are too different. This really isn't much of an explanation. Let's go further in the paper. Here's another quote. Pure constant frequency signals with Doppler shift compensation are arguably the most sophisticated echolocation signals used by any animal. And it is remarkable that such signals and processing mechanisms evolved independently. Yeah, that's pretty remarkable. It's not telling me how the echolocation evolved. This is what you get in the literature. I'm not cherry picking here. They don't have an explanation for how it evolved. For a paper entitled The Evolution of Echolocation in Bats, it really doesn't say much about the evolution of echolocation in bats. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. I mean, at least these things fall into an evolutionary pattern. You've got this evolutionary tree. Isn't that a little bit coincidental? I mean, why? Why would that happen? Well, it would be coincidental if it was true. It's not true. Here is an evolutionary tree of bats. Along the top, you have the current day extant bats, several examples of types of bats. These are not all of them. These are bats that use echolocation. And down at the bottom, you've got their common ancestor a long time ago. Now, the colors represent different types of echolocation. So you've got different types of echolocation that the biosonar that the bats are using. What you want to see as an evolutionist is you want to see the colors cluster. One branch should have one color, another branch should have another color, and so forth. It's not happening. I mean, look, it's all distributed, it's dispersed. This isn't aligned. It is, remember, incongruent. We looked at that last time. It's another example. The species do not form an evolutionary tree. This is yet another example. What do they say? The animal's habitat is often more important in shaping its call design than is its evolutionary history. If you want to understand echolocation in bats, look at its habitat, not the theory of evolution. This is remarkable. What they're saying is, let's toss the theory of evolution. It's not helping us any. It's superfluous. Okay. That's that example. Second one, DNA code. You've all heard of the DNA code. This is the DNA code. It's a table here. What is the DNA code? It is a code that translates your DNA, a gene in your DNA, to a protein. Nucleotides translated into amino acids. That's what it is. This diagram is an illustration, a cartoon of that process. It's much more complicated than this, of course. But you see your nucleus with the DNA, and it's making copies of it, and then the copy goes over, and the DNA code is used to translate that into a protein. Proteins are used all along the way. They're used in each step, the copying from the DNA and so forth. Did you hear that? Proteins are used all along the way to do what? Make proteins. Proteins are needed to make proteins. You can't make a protein without having proteins. How do those proteins get made? It's a chicken or the egg problem. This is a problem for evolution. Now, furthermore, this DNA code is found in all the species. It's really remarkable. Every species across the entire biology uses essentially the same DNA code, usually identical. What does this mean if you're an evolutionist? So if you have two designs, if you have two neighboring species that have the same design, then according to evolution, that design is going to be coming from its common ancestor. That's the way the theory works. You got the same design in two species, it's going to come from the common ancestor. If that design is in three species, you go back to the earlier common ancestor, right? That's the way the theory works. You look at these things, common designs are going to come from a common ancestor. If the design is in all the species, like the DNA code is, then what? The design comes from the ultimate common ancestor. It's going to come way back at the very beginning of evolutionary history. When evolution first started, the common ancestor of all life had what? The DNA code. Those proteins, those mechanisms, the code. It's amazing that it is not plausible that this would have evolved in the very early stages of evolution. It's not plausible that it would evolve at all, for that matter, but it's even more difficult that it would have to occur in the early stages. Now, what happened after that? You had the common ancestor. Somehow, by some miracle, it evolved early in the stages of evolution. And then what? It didn't change. Right? It's the same in every species, so it didn't change for millions and billions of years. Why did it not change? Well, according to the theory of evolution, the only reason there would be it couldn't. It was robust. Any change would have, thrown a monkey wrench into the system. You can't evolve the code. It's not evolvable. Yet it had to evolve. The code cannot evolve for billions of years, and yet somehow you got that in the first place. It can't evolve, but it evolved. That's a problem. Another problem, because it evolved so early in evolutionary history, evolutionists have always said, well, it's kind of a fluke. Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the DNA structure and Nobel laureate, famously called it a frozen accident. Here's a textbook that follows up on this. The code seems to have been selected arbitrarily. Another textbook, the code is then what Crick called a frozen accident. The original choice of the code was an accident. Hey, it's a fluke. It's happenstance. It's claptrap. It just happened to fall together. Well, this is all driven by the theory. There's no science here. There's no experiments. There's no analysis. There's no math. This is all driven by the dogma of evolution. What does the science say? What does the science say about the DNA code? Yes, it is very special. There is a structure. There is a logic. It is actually a fantastic code. It is not just any old code. Even if you could somehow explain how a code could arise by random mutations, which you can't, you have to explain how a 1 in a million code would arise. Here's a paper that says the DNA code is nearly optimal for encoding multiple layers of information. Here's a paper that says the code optimizes a combination of several different functions simultaneously. We wonder what other remarkable properties it may bear. Yeah, it is an amazing code, and we're still finding things out about it. It's a very special code. So, summary. We looked at two more scientific evidences that show that the scientific evidence contradicts evolution in many different ways. It's a problem. The theory isn't working. Thank you. Professor Ruse mentioned adaptation, and he also mentioned homology and embryology. I do want to talk about adaptation now, but I'm going to quickly say something about homology and embryology because those arguments have largely failed. They were one of the keystone arguments, keystone pillar arguments, and still are textbook evidences for evolution, and they have largely failed. I'll say regarding embryology, just for an example, we have a lot of emerging examples of non-homologous embryological pathways in similar neighboring species. In other words, you've got two species on the same branch of evolution, two species of frog or what have you, and lo and behold, their embryological pathways, the way that they are developed, is different. That doesn't make any sense on evolution. So the embryology argument has failed, and the homology argument has failed too. The pentadactyl pattern, for example, we have 5 digits, penta 5 dactyl digits, touchers on our forelimb and our hind limb. Professor Ruse showed kind of a graphic of that. So that's been a very powerful argument. Why would we have these 5 digits on so many different animals? It's not just humans. It's all these animals have this pentadactyl pattern. Well, it turns out there are all kinds of animals that do not have the 5 digits, and they are sprinkled about in the evolutionary tree. So evolutionists have had to say, oh, okay, well, I guess it can evolve and devolve and re-evolve, and so now the pentadactyl pattern is not necessarily due to common descent. It can be due to common mechanism. It can re-evolve. So you've basically lost the motive or the causation for the homology argument. Okay, on to this talk. I wanted to finish up with one more scientific problem, kind of a primary core problem with evolution, and it has to do with adaptation. Okay. You've heard of random mutations. What does that exactly mean? Why is a mutation random? The idea in evolutionary theory is that it's random with respect to need. So when mutations occur, they know nothing of the need of the organism. And I'll just give you a couple of quotes from some top leading evolutionists to this effect. Sir Ronald Fisher. The essence of Darwinian evolution is that populations adapt by producing mutations that are random with respect to the organism's need. Sir Julian Huxley, grandson of Darwin confidant Thomas Huxley. Mutation is a random affair. It takes place in all directions. Their effects are not related to the needs of the organism. So this classic view of evolution looks like this. You have random mutations that are independent of the environment. They occur in a single individual. They are gradual. So that means you're going to have gradual improvement because you got to wait for good mutations to come along. So it's going to be gradual. It's going to be slow change. It's going to take deep time, millions of years. And it's generally not repeatable. These are random mutations. Who knows what's going to happen? And so you get a picture kind of like this, where you have one individual in a population gets a mutation. If it's not a bad one, then maybe it starts to propagate. Its progeny, its children has it, and it slowly propagates throughout the population. Hopefully it's going to change things for the better. That's kind of the picture that you have. A chance mutation propagates over time. Let me give you a quote from Jacques Monod, Nobel laureate, evolutionist from 1971, who talks about this view, this model of evolution. Chance alone is at the source of every innovation, of all creation in the biosphere. Pure chance, absolutely free but blind, at the very root of the stupendous edifice of evolution. This central concept of modern biology is no longer one among other possible or even conceivable hypotheses. It is today the sole conceivable hypothesis, the only one that squares with observed and tested fact. And nothing warrants the supposition or the hope that on this score our position is likely ever to be revised. This ain't changing. Well, it's all changed. It's all false. This is all dogma. What do we actually observe? Often what we observe are environmentally induced changes in multiple individuals across the population. This leads to abrupt improvement. So you're going to have rapid change in a generation or a few generations. And it's repeatable. Biology is giving us good science. This is repeatable. That's good science. Let me give you some examples of this. Okay, before that, here's a picture of it then. So you've got, unlike the other picture, more of a quick change. You've got a population, an environmental challenge comes along, something happens, boom, very rapidly a large, significant fraction of the population responds within a few generations. Very different picture. Simultaneous, rapid adaptations. It is not evolution. This is not random. It is not independent of the environment. It does not happen in a single individual. It's not gradual. It's not slow. It's not unrepeatable. It's not evolution. This is something different. Let me give you some examples. About 10 years ago, biologists visited a small island off of Croatia because they were checking up on some lizards. Italian lizards had been introduced into that island a few years before. And they were shocked to find that these lizards had changed so much. They were bigger, they had bigger heads, they had a stronger bite, they had a new structure in their gut, all because there's different vegetation on this island. Italian lizards introduced to a tiny island are evolving in ways that would normally take millions of years to play out. Here's guppies. Researchers have done this same sort of thing with guppies. They put them into different environments and they've adapted. Researchers who once assumed evolution required millennia are documenting species adapting in mere decades or even shorter time frames. Same thing with mussels in New England. In New England, they've done some studies with mussels placed into new environments. This article explains that muscles placed into a new environment adapted in an evolutionary nanosecond compared to the thousands of years previously assumed. The scientific evidence is contradicting the theory. It's not what was expected. The findings were repeatable. They did multiple experiments, got the same answer. Yeast is another good model system that's been used. Here's a paper out of Israel that they had some yeast populations, exposed them to some challenges. The adaptation was due to a response of many individual cells to the change in environment, not due to selection. This study therefore details a process that is different from the fundamental common view of adaptation. This isn't evolution. This is directed adaptation, intelligent directed adaptation. Flax plants have been a great model system. They've been studied for decades with this sort of thing. This paper talks about repeatable mutations in the flaxseed genome. They actually had a mutation occurred due to varying fertilizer levels. Quote, the identical genetic insertion was observed in 5 independent experiments. These events cannot simply be a result of random stochastic probabilities. So there's this incredible adaptation machine built into the species. Species are able to adapt rapidly to conditions that were unforeseen. That's a pretty amazing thing, and it refutes, it contradicts evolution. Why? Because directed adaptation machines for future unforeseen conditions wouldn't help. If you did somehow evolve that, and that's a whole other story, how are you going to get that from random mutations? But if somehow you could evolve that, it wouldn't be selected for. It wouldn't help any because it's good for some future unforeseen condition. And what counts in evolution is now. You have to have mutations and changes that help now. If it isn't helping now, it's not going to be selected for. It's going to degrade with mutations. That's if somehow this fantastic adaptation machine, which is different in all these different species, by the way. This would have to evolve over and over and over and over again in all these different species somehow, and then it wouldn't be selected for. It doesn't make any sense. The scientific evidence contradicts the theory. Okay, so summary. I've looked at these different failures. It's not working. Evolutionists are chained to an old idea. So I want to leave you with this thought. A world of scientific adventure awaits us. Evolutionists need to cut their philosophical chains. When the new physics of quantum mechanics came along a century ago, old certainties had to be let go. Some people were able to do that. Others were not. Either way, science moves forward. You can be part of it, or you can stand in the way. Thank you.